chips of ice, and they fly past the window like a firefly might. My mission ended up being controversial because I overshot the landing by, I think, 200 miles. So my flight did contribute a lot of new knowledge to the science of spaceflight, and it took the form of redesign. But all flights do that. You know, we stand on the shoulders of those who go before us, whether or not they overshoot.
The interesting part of the Mercury mission of Sigma 7 was that we went over the South Atlantic, and prior to that mission, the Russians had set off a nuclear bomb at high altitude. So we had radiation devices that would measure 10 Rankins, 5 Rankins, 1 Rankin, and a half Rankin, something like that. I didn't get a reading on any of those things, so it turned out we were okay. So we could go on and let Cooper go over the South Atlantic over many, many times.
It truly was the age of Aquarius in the 60s. The mood around us was always electric. The press revered the astronauts, and it revered those of us in the front of the program. They looked up to us, and we felt the responsibility, so the feeling was mutual. The country supported what we did.
We were pushing technology.
Stand by to white to the bird, and they can lie by early bird. White. And
Communication satellites, of course, came into being, and a lot of other neat things have happened as a result of that technology push.
The country was trying to build a supersonic transport, at least to do some research and build some prototypes. So by trying to study the flow fields about these vehicles, trying to compute the sonic booms and their propagation to the ground was a very interesting and challenging problem.
There was a lot of interest in Mars, largely because of the publicity which the planet received at the hands of Percival Lowell in the early 1900s. He reported that he saw canals.
The Martians plan to throw a dance for all the human race.
He made out a pretty good case that the planet must have intelligent life form. And so there was a lot of interest in Mariner 4 then, because it was successfully flown past Mars, taking some photographs as it went by. The most important piece of data from Mariner 4 was the photograph number 11, which showed very clearly a crater which looked just like the craters on the moon. Although by today's standards, the quality of these pictures is pretty poor, they were definitely showing that Mars was much more like the moon than it was like the Earth.
Gemini was the program between Mercury, the single-seater in Earth orbit, and Apollo, the three-seater all the way to the moon.
2, 1, 0. Ignition start. Liftoff.
Gemini, of course, carried 2 people, but it wasn't the people that it carried, it was the concepts.
You don't know what we can see. Why don't you tell your dreams to me? Fantasy will set you free.
I feel like $1 million. I'm going to pick up.
Gemini was a great program because we learned how to operate in space, how to do EVA, how to use computers.
I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations.
So what we did with Gemini, we did rendezvous, which I was very thrilled to do. We did the docking, we did the change of orbit, we did a precise re-entry. All of those were very important to go into the moon and back.
Gemini 12, Houston, Capcom. New EVA record. Beautiful job.
Apollo 1 was to be the first manned test of the Apollo spacecraft. So it was a real shocker to find that we lost a crew, not in space, but right there on the pad.
The fire on the pad was a traumatic event. It ripped us apart, to be perfectly honest with you. It was a terrible day.
That her face at first just goes sleep. turn the wider shade of pale.
We were not doing a good job. We were running too fast. It forced us to reconsider what we were doing and do the job properly. Without that having happened, I don't think we would have gotten to the moon in the 60s.
5, 4, ignition, your
5 weeks later, as the backup crew, we inherited the first manned Apollo mission, which turned out to be Apollo 7. But as with many things with NASA, what was a disaster with Apollo 1 turned out to be a real triumph with Apollo 7, because the spacecraft itself was a marvelous flying machine. It went 11 days.
We have you go for orbit here, go for orbit.
So we were quite proud of the fact that we took and had a triumph out of a disaster.
And that was what Apollo 7 did for me. It proved that we could do all the things we set out to do and do them well.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We are still go at this time. T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Go ahead, Houston. All right, you are go for TLI, over. Roger, understand, we're go for TLI.
The first full-up Saturn launch of all the rockets went to the moon with humans on it. They never even tested the individual stages. They just stacked them all up, stuck the people up there and says, let's try it out, send them to the moon. That is audacious.
Give us a clue as to what it looks like from way up there.
I can see the entire Earth now out of the center window.
I see trees of green,
I can see Florida,
red roses.
Cuba, Central America, the whole northern half of Central America, in fact, all the way down through Argentina.
And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
This transmission is coming to you approximately halfway between the moon and the Earth. We have about less than 40 hours left to go to the moon.
The first time we flew a crew on a big Saturn V, we sent them to the moon. For 10 orbits, not just to swing around the back. Very bold decision.
The moon is essentially gray, no color. Looks like plaster of Paris, or sort of a grayish beach sand.
On Apollo 8, when we rotated the spacecraft and saw for the very first time the far side of the moon, only 60 miles below, we were like 3 school kids looking into a candy store window. Kind of forgot the flight plan for a second as those ancient old craters on the far side slowly slipped by.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth.
I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Optimistic that Apollo 11 would actually land and actually return somebody successfully. I thought we'd get away with our lives. I wasn't too worried about that, but I just thought there were so many unknowns that I would have given us about a 50-50 chance of being the first flight to land and return someone safely.
All flight controllers, go, no, go for landing. Retro. Go. Fido. Go. Guidance. Go. Control. Go. Telcom. Go. GNC. Go. Ecom. Go. Surgeon. Go. Capcom, we're go for landing. Altitude 4200. Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet.
There are certain events in life that you never forget. And the lunar landing, and in particular the last seconds leading up to the landing, will never be forgotten. We had battled to get to the surface. We're halfway to our abort limit. About the time we got that sorted out, we started having a series of computer program alarms.
1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. 1201 alarm. Stand type, we're go, flight. Okay, we're go.
And as the crew took over at about 2 minutes prior to landing, searching for a landing site, we knew that they were going to be using a lot more fuel than we had expected.
540 feet and a 15.
They keep doing this, they're going to run out of fuel.
Altitude, velocity, light. 3.5 down.
Didn't really have a good hard feeling about just how far they were from actually landing, you know. They kept going and going and going, you know. And
What were our chances of landing successfully? Getting outside, that was pretty easy to do. It was touching down so that later missions could touch down and then do the rest of the stuff. But the landing with 15 seconds of fuel remaining, that was the important thing.
4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
it was like, gee whiz.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Okay, keep the chatter down in this room.
The unfortunate thing is no controller had an opportunity to absorb the emotion of that landing because we had to work for the next 2 hours, nonstop.
Okay, T1, stay, no stay. Retro. Stay. Fido. Stay. Guidance. Stay. Control. Stay. Telcom. Stay. GNC. Stay. Ecom. Stay. Surgeon. Stay. Capcom, we're stay for T1. And we're getting a picture on the TV. You got a good picture, huh?
Up until that moment, television had always been a goal, but not a requirement.
The limb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches.
Once we landed safely, the only thing that counted was for us to see the picture.
I'm going to step off the limb now.
What I felt at that moment was the TV better work or else, and if it doesn't, they really will know who I am because I'll be the man who didn't bring you television from the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Come on, come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe. Can't you see that I am not afraid? What was that promise that you made?
Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
The world just marveled at this right along with us, and we more or less made the whole world our partners in this thing by inviting people to be there. I think that's one of the best things we ever did in the space program, and one of the best decisions ever made with regard to the space program was to share that with the world.
For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one.
Come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe.
I think it was the biggest event from an aviation point of view and probably from a scientific point of view that happened in the 20th century and maybe in the history of man.
Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. It came in peace for all mankind.
Apollo 11, Apollo 11, this is Hornet, Hornet, over. Apollo 1, there's Apollo 11, reading you loud and clear.
Well, we had a good time on Apollo 12, and so we were happy to go and anxious for the great adventure. And so off we go, and we go into a thunderstorm immediately after launch and get hit by lightning, and it lights up a lot of caution and warning lights, and we didn't know what to do.
I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop out. I'm not sure you get hit by lightning.
Thank God for Mission Control, because they came up and gave us some advice, and so we powered it back up again with their help, and everything worked out okay. We went into orbit and then off to the moon.
Hey, there it is. There it is. Son of a gun, right down the middle of the road.
They landed us perfectly. If we had not touched the controls, we would have landed right in the middle of the crater that we were shooting for.
Boys on the ground do okay.
So they wouldn't have missed it by 10 feet. And when you figure we went 240,000 miles, that's pretty amazing. Shows you the kind of capability that NASA has.
He's got it made. Come on in there. 24 feet. Contact light. Roger, copy contact. And that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.
So we got out for that time, and we placed some experiments, and then we collected a lot of rocks and made some observations.
I have the decided impression I don't want to move too rapidly, but I can walk quite well. Dum, 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 dum.
And then our primary job had been to land near Surveyor, which was an unmanned spacecraft that had landed on the moon in the Ocean of Storms some 33 months earlier.
Boy, you'll never believe it. Look what I see sitting on the side of the crater. The old Surveyor, huh? The old Surveyor, yes, sir. Does that look neat?
So we were going to land there and pick up some parts like the TV camera and the scoop and things like that, bring them back to Earth for evaluation.
Apollo 13 was a team effort from the very beginning to the end.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Go ahead. We've had a hardware restart. I don't know what it was.
Okay. Houston, we've had a problem.
When the crew threw the switches to start the crowd stir, a spark jumped between the fan and the heater assembly, and the pressure in that tank rose very rapidly because the insulation had been damaged on the system. And we now had a fire inside the tank that blew the dome of the tank off.
That made me bus wonderful.
That series of events started the saga of Apollo 13.
And we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
The exact words I used in mission control is, "We have never lost an American in space, and we sure as hell aren't going to lose one now. This crew is coming home. You got to believe it. Your team must believe it, and we must make it happen."
It looks to me you're looking out the hatch, so we are inventing something.
When we suddenly realized the true significance of the explosion, seeing the oxygen escape from the rear end of my spacecraft and consequently losing all the electrical power and the propulsion system, we knew we were in serious trouble.
Have you called in your backup ECOMs now? See if we can get some more brain power in this thing? We got one here. Roger.
Throughout the entire Apollo 13 mission, the teams in mission control changed shifts almost regularly at 8-hour intervals. And the teams kept the mission going, kept working the problem as my teams tried to come up with the answers.
Go ahead, Flight. I want you to get some guys figuring out minimum power in the LEM to sustain life.
Fortunately, the lunar module was attached to us, and when that occurred, with oxygen almost gone in the command module, we transferred the command to the lunar module, and try to use it somehow, some way, as a lifeboat to get home.
Let's solve the problem, but let's not make it any worse by guessing.
I got a lot of recognition for the work that we did, but the real heroes of Apollo 13 were the people in the back rooms and over in the engineering facilities who came up with the answers we needed.
We never talked among ourselves about not making it back home. It was like playing a game of solitaire. As long as we had a card and we could put it someplace, the game kept going.